Hey guys, it's Elon Musk. Oh yeah, that's a balalaika, and that's a kokoshnik. Since I've been labeled an agent of the Kremlin, I have to do something about it. Why did they get me labeled? Because of these two tweets. I stated my goals a long time ago. I want to colonize Mars, travel to other planets, and rename them to X. There's one thing we need to do before we can conquer space. We need to make sure we don't perish in a nuclear apocalypse. And today we're closer to that than ever before, yet not without NATO's involvement. And as the North Atlantic Alliance celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, I would like to add my share of skepticism to the celebration and ask a question. What would have happened if NATO had stopped when it was at the age of 44? In other words, should NATO have been dissolved in 1991? To begin with, let me remind you that NATO was created as a counterweight to the Warsaw Pact countries, a military bloc created by the USSR in Eastern Europe. True, the creation of NATO dates back to 1949, and the Warsaw Pact was signed in 1955. But who believes Wikipedia today? There's really no deception here.
This is the bitter truth.
Soviet troops stayed in the Eastern European countries they had liberated and controlled the political regimes there. It's just that they didn't officially become an organization until 10 years later, the same way the states left their troops on military bases to control their political regimes. During the Cold War, NATO's existence was justified as a defense against communism. Capitalists were more afraid of the Soviets than women were of dating Kanye West.
We should support the laws which the United States has passed in order to protect us from those who would destroy us from within.
The NATO Charter says that if one country is attacked, all countries in the alliance are attacked too. So the nuclear status of the countries that guarantee the alliance also protects weaker countries like Italy and the Netherlands from any hypothetical threats from the USSR. But in 1991, the USSR collapsed and the Western world won.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
So, what should an organization created to defend against the Warsaw Pact do after the military bloc of Warsaw Pact countries dissolved? But there's logic, common sense, and bureaucracy. Name me an international organization that has voluntarily ceased to exist. Just imagine for a moment that you were a hero of the Cold War, a shield of capitalism, and then one day you're as useless as panorama mode on a cell phone. Let me put it another way. If these useless international organizations are able to realize their uselessness and dissolve themselves, why does the UN still exist? It's no surprise that NATO didn't want to dissolve. The warhammer stayed in the hands of officials. And as we know, if you have a hammer in your hands, everything around you appears to be nails. That was it. The moment was gone. In other words, the NATO bloc isn't needed to solve international local conflicts. And it seems that just a few European countries and UN peacekeepers could have stopped the war in Yugoslavia, such as Iraq or Syria, as well as the famous bombing of the Balkans, were handled by the US on their own or with an international coalition. It turns out that the only real purpose of the UN-dissolved NATO was to oppose something serious and global. And given that China was like the internet in the 90s, feeble and sad, it was clear who the enemy was. Well, NATO did everything it could to make this enemy real. Two things are most often discussed in the world today: whether sandals can be worn with socks, and whether NATO promised Russia not to expand eastward. We're more concerned about the first one, but we'll talk about the latter. We'll also be joined by a fresh voice on Russia, journalist Tucker Carlson. Oh, Tucker, did you decide to make fun of those who blame you for the engagement with Russia?
I don't know what you mean.
Tucker, do you think the U.S. promised Russia not to expand NATO eastward?
I think so, although it doesn't really matter. The West understood perfectly well that Russia would not like a military bloc approaching its borders that it did not belong to. The Russians are fools not to sign some document. So are the Americans. When Russia was weak, it could have signed anything, and there would be no questions now. And so, from Russia's point of view, it has quite reasonable claims. The West broke a promise. In this case, we can also break promises, including expansion to former USSR republics.
Didn't the states see this coming?
U.S. foreign policy is like a 3-year-old's math homework. For every one right decision, there are 10 wrong ones. Is it possible to piss off Moscow and demand that all former Soviet republics hand over their nuclear weapons at the same time?
That's what I was talking about, thanks, Tucker. If NATO hadn't expanded eastward, there wouldn't be a conflict. All of NATO's plans were based on Russia not having ambitions of its own after 1991. That's all there is to know about the analytical skills of NATO officials. It could end up hitting the bloc countries themselves. NATO offers a non-aggression guarantee to all its members, regardless of whether they're responsible for their words and actions or not. If there's an unfriendly country with nuclear weapons next to you, it's probably best not to try to provoke it. Just imagine a real armed conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. Europe would immediately become useless. Russia would become very important, and then the Baltic states would be sacrificed to the current politics. And many European politicians don't seem to think about what will happen tomorrow. It's as if they're preparing to become officials in the North Atlantic Alliance. This lack of responsibility is also a consequence of the fact that the NATO bloc wasn't dissolved in 1991. It is believed that countries should decide for themselves who to be friends with, who not to be friends with, which bloc to join, which not. But in fact, after the collapse of the USSR, there was no alternative to NATO. When you have a monopolistic military bloc next to you, you have to either arm yourself or join it. Eastern Europe was short on cash at the time, and everything Western was in style. Local politicians couldn't say no, even if they knew they'd have to spend more on defense than they wanted because American weapons weren't cheap. Just picture this. Donald Trump wins the US election, and he's been scaring European countries for a while now, saying that he'll stop defending them if they don't chip in on US foreign policy. Trump has already said that if he wins, he can stop the war in Europe and force Ukraine to give up Crimea and Donbass. He's thinking like a cynical businessman and believes that in competition with China, the US could use an ally such as Russia. He wants to run the country like a corporation and sees no point in spending his money on someone else's security. Yet, how many Americans think the same way will be shown by the election in November. You say that countries would just leave the alliance? Well, name me one country that has left NATO. Maybe it's not such a voluntary organization after all. Now, since this is my show, let's take my skepticism to its logical conclusion and imagine that NATO self-dissolved in 1991. What would become of Europe then? The EU already existed, and Eastern European countries would have joined it sooner or later. They would have created their own security bloc or armed forces. Since this would not have been possible without Russia, it would have joined too, as it did in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Then again, if things had gone differently, today's conflict would not have happened. Europe would have its own independent policy. Germany and Russia would be allies. Not an option for Washington, but a nightmare. The United States had a great chance to avoid future conflicts by making Russia a showcase of capitalism, as the Americans once did with South Korea, Japan, and West Germany. Investments in open markets would have prevented Russia from sliding into the thuggery of the 90s, wouldn't have created a fear of capitalism, and would have allowed not only the pro-government elites and oligarchs, but also ordinary citizens to enjoy the benefits of civilization. Yeah, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the nuclear disarmament of the former republics cost the West too little. Russians say, the miser pays twice. And today Russia wouldn't be a pain in the neck for the United States, but one of the centers of the Western world, helping to process migration flows from Asia and Africa, restraining China, and having all the natural resources it needs. Of course, Russia is not Japan, where the distances and amounts of tasks are different. Yet the Americans did not drop atomic bombs on Russia. If we want this episode to look less like an ad for Russia, we need to mention other possible developments. For instance, if NATO had been dissolved in 1991, we could have seen the entire Eastern Europe become Yugoslavia. This would have been based on long-standing historical contradictions, such as between Ukrainians and Poles, Hungarians and Bulgarians, Armenians and Turks. Historically, Europe was never such a peaceful place as it was between 1945 and 1991, when it was controlled by the Soviets and the United States. Or the communists coming back into power in Russia and new tanks on the streets of Prague and Budapest. What should we do about it now? Is there a way to fix the situation, or do I have to abandon my drone cab project and start over with a time machine? The only one who can do something about NATO is the one who funds it. If the US decides to dissolve the North Atlantic Alliance, Europe won't put up much of a fight. But there are three issues here. The first is that it's currently impossible. Second, a country that thinks national debt is fun is unlikely to care much about the costs. And the third thing is that the US wants to create a global military alliance based on NATO to fight countries that have different ideas about the world. These are China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So Europe needs to be ready to either get dragged into a new arms race or be used as a bargaining chip in serious negotiations. To sum up, let me put it this way. NATO is a relic of the past, just like the USSR. But NATO won't leave, and we're seeing many features of the USSR returning to Russia. Dinosaurs aren't swans, but if they lived as a couple, they should also leave as a couple. As long as there are any military blocs, we'll continue to focus on weapons and tanks rather than colonizing Mars. After all, any military alliance is united against someone else. And if there is no enemy, one is invented. So we need to either stop fighting or invent aggressive Martians and unite against them. It doesn't matter if the Martians don't exist as long as it's funded. That's all for today. Live peacefully, use your brain, and don't believe everything you see.